Welcome back to The Right Ingredients. Today's episode is a little bit different. I've got two guests with me because I think the topic we're getting into really needs two perspectives. Now, across the ingredients industry, companies are investing heavily in growth, innovation pipelines, acquisitions, and new market strategies. But if we're honest, a lot of those initiatives don't deliver what they're supposed to. So the question I want to ask is why? And more importantly, what does that mean for the people these companies hire, how teams are structured, and how careers actually evolve in this space? Now, to explore that, I'm joined by two guests who see this from different angles. Let me introduce both of you properly, because I think the contrast in perspectives is what will make this conversation truly interesting. To you first, Jasper. Your background spans strategy, corporate, and building businesses yourself. You've worked as a strategist at Ahold Delhaize, co-founded and scaled a food business, and now advise ingredient and CPG companies on how to actually bring products to market successfully. Now, what I find particularly interesting about your work is that you sit right in the gap between R&D and commercial. You're not just looking at ideas, but whether they translate into real value. So, for those listening, give us a little bit of a context. What's the lens you look at this industry through today?
I mean, I think it's really an interesting time to now be in the industry because so much is changing, I think, with AI, geopolitics, GLP-1, etc. So the predictability has never been, or the uncertainty has never been bigger. So that also means there's a lot of opportunity for innovation and a need for innovation. So it's a really interesting time to now be working in the industry. And the way we work is we really help large ingredient businesses or mainly large ingredient businesses, but also, food CPGs, food retailers, with figuring out what are, the best bets they can place right now to be prepared for all these possible different scenarios. And then how can we make sure that they, commercialize these innovations in a really good way. So get to the highest probability of making sure each bet succeeds.
Fantastic. Over to you, Kai. Your perspective comes from a different angle. You're an independent strategy advisor at Hawk Management currently, working closely with both companies and investors from across the ingredient space. Now, from what I see is a lot of your work sits around growth strategy, M&A, and transformation. So you're often involved, I would assume, when companies are trying to scale, integrate acquisitions, or really unlock value. And you see where that either works or can break down. So for those listening, can you give a quick overview of your background and the types of situations you typically get pulled into?
Yeah. Thanks, Charlie, for having the opportunity to be part of that conversation here. Yeah, right. So I'm an independent advisor for strategy and M&A in the space of food ingredient, being the B2B part of the value chain, and then also machinery and equipment manufacturers targeting food production. Over the course of several projects I performed, and then also I was a manager myself in the ingredient industry. The key question to me is always, is there a strategy available? If so, is that really thought through? So what I mean with that is not only having, let's say, a vision mission statement with a few sentences, but is there professional strategy work carried out? Meaning, do I understand the markets? Who is my target market? What about the size of the market, growth rates, underlying trends? Then, do I know about positioning of my competitors? What about my internal strength and performance? And then bringing all this together and ending up in a target picture with qualitative, quantitative targets that everyone is knowing of, which is at least transparent for the board, and then everyone is working against that target.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you both for those introductions and welcome. I think why I wanted to have you both on this to unravel this conversation and this topic is I think what's interesting is that although you both come at this from different angles, you're both ultimately looking at the same outcome: growth, performance, and value creation. So let's get into where that starts to break down. Kai, I'll start with you. If we take a step back, companies are not short of strategy. They have innovation pipelines, they make acquisitions, they invest in new capabilities. But a lot of it doesn't translate into real commercial success. So from your perspective, Kai, at a high level, what's actually going wrong?
Yeah, right. So most of the companies, they operate from a position of strength. So they have high equity ratios, they have healthy balance sheets. And yes, they want to invest, and actually they do, but how does it all fit together? So do they really understand the markets they are operating in? Do they, let's say, phase their activities, meaning they think through one idea and then really follow it through and take action? Or do they just, let's say, want to fix here and there something, but not working against a roughly thought through strategy?
Interesting. And just bringing you in from the innovation side, when you look at technically strong innovation, why does it so often fail to land commercially?
It's probably a bit related to what Kai was saying, but I see it often break down in two different phases. Either early on, it's because the ingredient company often is kind of building or creating, developing what it can make, but not necessarily what it should make. So there's a lack of real customer understanding, really figure out how they make decisions, what would make them switch to a different ingredient. And then I think later in the process, often after the pilot phase, so you have something which works successfully in a small scale, there's no real pathway to integrate that well into the core organization. So for instance, you bring it into the core organization, but your sales managers, they're not incentivized to suddenly start selling, tiny volumes of an ingredient, which is quite risky. They get much more reward from actually focusing on the current portfolio. So I think this is where the phases and the reasons why I think it often can be disappointing when you have like a really good ingredient, but then it's not a success.
Yeah, I think you are, Kai, but are you seeing the same pattern from an M&A and transformation perspective as what Jasper's described there, or is the failure happening somewhere else in the system?
Yeah. Also with to me, it's super important at the very beginning to clarify what you want to achieve with acquiring, be it a competitor, be it someone operating in an adjacent field of business, meaning the investment criteria. So do we have clarity on, do I want to invest in a mature business or startup or an early stage business? And then what size? And do I want to buy in a new market also, or is it just capacity expansion? And that is crucial for subsequent activities such as finding the right target.
Yeah. Okay. And staying on the innovation side of things for the moment, to Jasper, where does the disconnect actually sit between R&D and commercial teams in most organizations, do you think?
But again, I think it really happens often before the lab work. So a lot of these organizations, ingredient-led organizations, they have scientists. And scientists are product first, right? So they're about, we go into the lab, we build a perfect thing, and then we launch it, and we hope it works. And I think you should actually first validate demand and see whether there's actual demand. So maybe to give an example, I think in 2021, I was working on a foresight piece around cocoa chocolate. And at that time, we already saw the signals that the cocoa prices might spike. So we thought, hey, cocoa alternatives might become interesting. But we didn't immediately go to the lab to figure out, can we actually make something which tastes good? What we did instead, we ran a lot of different Instagram ads with, a cocoa-free bar, and we checked, are people clicking on this? Are they then putting it in their basket? So you can de-risk much more, both from a consumer as from a customer perspective. Are we building something that we have evidence for that it will be a commercial success? And I think that mindset to really obsess first about your customer and their problems is often lacking. And then when you say R&D and commercial, the fact that it's already two different departments, you really want them to work, especially for innovations, work together from the beginning and have that joint accountability about, what does the customer want, and are we actually creating something which will solve something from there?
Definitely. And do you think that's the biggest mistakes companies make, or do you think there's other mistakes that they make when they're trying to take an idea from concept all the way through to market?
Yeah, there are multiple mistakes. Another one which I often see is premature scaling. So you have something, and you have a handful of customers who are actually really enthusiastic about the ingredient you created, but that doesn't necessarily mean that kind of your early majority, that they will also like it. So you're already kind of expanding production, but then you notice, hey, nobody else is buying this except for these early adopters. What's going on? That's one. Yeah. Another one is, I also think is, Yeah, ingredient companies they define innovation quite narrowly. Innovation for them is a new ingredient, but often that ingredient to succeed, it might need something around it. Like for instance, additional formulation support or,
Hmm.
even a co-investment in your customer's line or a different commercial model because it's so new. And so if you think you can just take a new ingredient and pop it into your machine and it will work like that and it will sell, you'll often be disappointed, I think.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jasper,
Good.
I'd like to add a few points to that. In my experience, there is really a few quite attractive underlying consumer trends. So meaning the B2C part of the food industry. And then the key question is, how does that translate into the B2B world? So what do those consumer trends really mean for me as an ingredient producer, and how can I pick them up?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the really good ingredient companies, they're not reactive to their customers. So they don't wait for, Nestle to tell them what to build. They actually already think, what does a consumer want? And then they go with the concepts to, for instance, Nestle to tell them, hey, this is what you want. And we have these ingredients which can help you create these concepts. I completely agree, Kai.
A lot of focus around innovation before sort of there even is a consumer need. I think that's super important for a lot of specialty ingredients. What I'm also seeing is across the industry, there's a lot of discussion around things like design thinking, lean validation, and especially for maybe startup space as well, as being comfortable with ambiguity, as well as for bigger companies as well. Jasper, what are those capabilities, or sorry, why are those capabilities still missing in so many innovation teams?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think for a lot of ingredient companies, and it's related to the B2B space. So
Yeah.
you don't have that many customers often. And the account managers, they're very protective of their customer relations. So when they have FaceTime with their customer, they really want to impress them. So they want to have polished slides, samples which you can taste, which are amazing. They really want to impress them. But if you talk, for instance, about design thinking, etc., it's you're not focused on selling. You're not in selling mode. You're in learning mode. So you actually want to listen to them and really figure out how they do things. Or you want to give them a rough prototype and ask them, tell me what's wrong with this. What are we not doing right here? And that feels very uncomfortable, I think. The irony is often if you do have these conversations with customers, you actually build better customer relations in the long term. And I also think it's kind of, there's often a wrong feeling about what progress looks like. If I have 4 weeks and we go into the lab and we come with fantastic prototypes of something, people will be very enthusiastic. But if I have 4 weeks and I just spend that time talking to a lot of customers, mapping how they currently do things, at the end you have a Word document or slides to show with a lot of very valuable customer insights, but it's often seen as less progress.
Mm-hmm. Understood. And Kai, listening to that from a transformation perspective, do you see those same gaps when you're working with companies during programs, change programs, or post-acquisition?
Yeah. To me, it's first of all a question of positioning. There is ingredient companies super strong in a few specific or even a single raw material. They know about the properties of that raw material. They know about sourcing, and they focus on making this ingredient available and at attractive price as well. Then there is others who are strong at developing applications and here and there target one or a few applications. So really understanding how their customers buying the ingredients are applying those ingredients. And that second thing is, especially to the smaller players, is costly. So applying ingredients into a final ready-to-eat or ready-to-drink system is a, let's say, costly marketing add-on that needs to be properly thought through.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that those issues come down to within the day-to-day teams, or is that more of a leadership and structural issue?
The leadership topic, first of all, and also a topic of resources and availability. So is there a dedicated team focusing on those product applications, and do they browse through the markets, understanding the trends, or is it just that I'm reacting to a customer asking me to present a final sample?
If a company does get innovation right in theory, but still fails commercially, where would you point the finger first?
Yeah. So commercial activity in my experience, always needs to be linked to the production capabilities, especially for the smaller players. There must be a link between the commercial planning, meaning I look at market potential, then I break down into customer potential, identify white spots, and then this is ultimately what I plan to sell at attractive margin as well. But then how do I make sure that also the production is capable of producing those ingredients in time?
Do you agree with Kai, or do you see it
And,
differently?
and then innovation in theory, getting that right means they what does that mean even? Getting innovation right in theory. Does that mean that they get an ingredient, like they're able to produce an ingredient which is technically sound,
Scalable,
etc.?
scalable.
Okay. Well, if it's marketable, then it should become a commercial success indeed, unless indeed their operations are not running well, which I think is what Kai was mainly hinting at. I haven't seen that much in my experience, but that's maybe also because I think I work with larger companies than you work with, Kai. No, so for me, it still goes back to what I said in the beginning. So early on, they're just building the wrong thing. Maybe I can illustrate with an example. I was talking with a relatively large food ingredient company in the Netherlands a couple of months ago, and they had created this new circular ingredient type of protein based on brewer spent grain. And a beautiful sustainability story. And they were telling me they were focused on bakery clients. And I asked them out of interest, okay, why are you focusing on bakery? And they said they had someone in the team who could make bread samples. So it was pure convenience why they had chosen that market and that application instead of like thinking, okay, we have this ingredient, should it go for meat alternatives or specialized nutrition? Or there's so many different markets you can go in, which all have different competitive dynamics. The cost in use is different, etc. And I think, especially actually now thinking about it for circular ingredients, choosing that right application first and really figuring out, will customers switch and do we have evidence for that before we start building it and, maybe even investing in a factory. I think that still often goes wrong. And it's so, even while saying it, it's such a basic thing, right? It should be, it seems so logical to do it. But still, you see these things going wrong.
Staying with protein for a moment, there is it's really important to target a few applications only, in my experience, because applying protein to meat alternatives or applying protein to increase the protein content of a cereal bar, for instance, is two completely different things.
Yeah, exactly. Completely agree.
So with taking that company as a perfect example, and an aside question here, would you say it's beneficial for companies with new technology, with a new product, to focus on one application area to begin with and then expand out from there? Or would you say it's better for businesses to attack multiple application?
Go ahead, Kai.
Talking about entering a new business area, I would really recommend to either focus on a strong raw material foundation or application competence and then pick a few applications. Because that is also what you see in the market, how the larger players of the ingredient industry evolve over the years. So those, let's say, multi-solution providers today, they have several raw ingredients and they have several applications, but that evolves over time.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Let's switch from innovation to more of the M&A space. There's a huge amount of acquisition activity across the ingredients industry, but a lot of deals that I'm seeing or hearing about don't deliver the value that was expected from both the companies that are making the acquisitions or mergers or the people that are actually working within these businesses. So from your experience, Kai, why do you think that is, especially at the moment?
Yeah, agreed, Charlie. The financial evaluation is usually quite high because we talk about the profitable business segments. Take flavor industry, for instance. Simply by looking at the financial valuation or value performing the valuation, you end up at high company prices. Yeah, but then, to me, it's important, as already mentioned, what do I want to achieve with that acquisition? So do I want to buy access or achieve access into a new market? do I want to enter a new ingredient category, and how does that fit to my existing business activities?
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what typically goes wrong after the deal is done?
Yeah. So all the functions, they need to be aligned. So decision in the very beginning must be, do I want to run it standalone? So I'm not saying that this can be a mistake. It can work. Or do I want to start integration, but then be fast? Yeah. Commercial activities, yeah, to make sure that there's not two different sales teams running to the same customers. And then also looking at innovation, how can I reduce my innovation cost overall by linking the activities of the two entities?
And when acquisitions and mergers do happen, I think there always needs to be clear communication that happens throughout the business, especially for leadership teams to really understand the plan moving forward and everything that's in place. From your perspective, Kai, where do leadership teams mostly underestimate the complexity of integration or transformation?
Yeah. From my experience, there is cases where they do not agree on a joint target picture. Yeah, so they do not operate as a team from the beginning. That really can be a challenge to aligning on what do they want to achieve as a company over the next couple of years. So do they have a target picture, and is this target picture broken down into targets, and then do they all work against a common goal?
And Jasper, from your perspective, when companies acquire new capabilities or technologies, why do you think that they still struggle to translate that into successful products or commercial outcomes?
I think it's again the incentive thing I said earlier. So is the core organization, the organization who adopts the new technology, are they really incentivized and supported to actually make that a commercial success? I think it also depends a little bit on which phase it is that you're buying the company. So is this a company which already has, product market fit and the goal is really to scale it? I think that's often easier than when you have a company which is much more earlier and still really searching for product market fit, because then you need much more, again, much more flexibility. I think leadership support is also one thing, because this new organization, they will require a lot of access to that core, the big organization which acquired it. They need access to the brand, customers, data, etc. So you really need to have someone in the leadership team who is emotionally invested and who kind of breaks down all these corporate barriers and gives them access to those assets. Otherwise, the new organization will just be fighting the organization they're entering in, instead of just focusing on customers again.
Understood. Okay. And in terms of mindset, I mean, for when we look at not the leadership, but more of the innovation and team perspective, what mindsets do you think, or ways of working do you think would be most beneficial for innovation and team perspective post-acquisition?
It's for me, yeah, Charlie?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, for mindset, I mean, I always go back for an innovation to work. It's, there are three principles, right? You need to have desirability, feasibility, viability. So desirability, do we really have customers who want to buy this? And I think this is often where ingredient companies are quite weak. So they do talk a bit with customers, but they're not obsessed with customers and their problem. Ideally, you have people who really, know the customer problem better than the customer itself. Then there's feasibility. This is where ingredient companies are pretty good. Can we make it? That's their core muscle. And then there's a viability part, which is, can we make the math work? Can we make it profitable? And there, what I often see is, a lot of the business cases I see is, it will become profitable if we scale it by, 10. So the volume goes up by 10x. But then that's often quite optimistic on how quickly they will get to that 10x, and also how much costs will drop in each line in the spreadsheet. And there's not a lot of evidence for that. So I think, especially on the desirability and the viability part, there's often some work to be done. And and then just in the way of working, it's just being very methodological and intellectually honest. Why would this be killed? So what are the assumptions underlying it? Can we test that? Can we find evidence for that? And can we honestly look at that evidence and pivot or kill something even if the evidence doesn't support it?
That's super interesting, the way that you've broken it down into that. Go ahead, Kai.
I like what you mentioned on costing, Jasper. So in my experience, it's important to have transparent costing structures. So do I really understand my cost position? So am I able to properly calculate new business activities? Take the flavor industry, for example. Yeah. The business is usually super broad because it's all or mostly make to order business. And then there is several kind of flavor types I need to offer to get into business with the larger players, because they usually say you get the big volumes only if you also take the small volumes, right?
Okay, interesting. I think we've discussed in terms of strategy and execution, and where I wanted to now bring it back is to what I see every day, and that's hiring, team structure, and leadership. Because a lot of what you're both describing sounds potentially like a people problem in certain elements of growing and developing, be it post-acquisition, be it novel technology, whatever it might be. So to Jasper, focusing on innovation teams specifically, what type of profiles, capabilities, or mindset do you think are missing in most teams today?
Yeah, I think there's one profile which is really often missing, which is something I would describe as a business builder. So it's not someone who's purely strategy, purely technological, and not purely commercial, but they can kind of hold all three together, and they can do a customer conversation in the morning, a steer co after that, analyze data from an experiment in the afternoon, and at the end of the day, they can make a tough decision about whether to continue or kill something and move on. And these are also people, they're making the product for the customer, but they're also pretty good at making the internal product. So really explaining clearly, how does it link to the strategy? How does it bring the company closer to what it wants to become, and making sure it doesn't only look like innovation theater. And I think that profile is often missing, and probably also because people hire very clearly in, you're either within commercial or technology, etc. So this is a bit more of a blurry profile which crosses the boundaries.
Is that common within flavor or ingredient companies from your perspective? In terms of those positions?
That they have vacancies for these positions, you mean,
Not
Charlie?
vacancies, but positions, people that are already within these businesses. Yeah.
So what I notice, it's often people who've created these positions for themselves. It's they've been recognized as being good at it, and then somehow they figure out how to, the organization sees value in it. They don't know what to name it exactly, and these people create that space for themselves, and then they're very successful.
And have you seen it commonly across the industry, or?
I think I do think you see it quite often. Yeah, those profiles, but it has different. It can have different names, and it can sit in different departments. Sometimes they're in R&D, sometimes they're in marketing. So that's why it's kind of hard to put your finger on them, on who they are. But these are you notice it immediately when you start speaking with people in the organization, because they refer to them. Oh, you need to speak to this person, and then you know who they are.
Okay. And Kai, from a strategy and M&A perspective, what capabilities are missing at maybe leadership level that stop companies from actually executing on growth?
Yeah. I think it's hard to find people that have experience in a field, take commercial, for instance, but then also even have small or a bit of piece experience in other fields, meaning innovation, meaning operations. Because someone working in sales, in my experience, doing a good job, the time he's selling an ingredient, he already starts thinking through what that would mean for the organization, for innovation work, for application work, and then also for operations.
Right. Okay. And out of curiosity, from businesses that you've worked with or seen in operation, when you look at companies that maybe do this well, what's different about the people they hire and how they structure their teams? Is there any trick to this? Is there something that you're seeing that is more beneficial? That's to you, Kai.
Yeah. So I think a good mix is really having experienced people from the ingredient industry, but then also having people that worked in food B2C, for instance, yeah, because then they can translate what they see on the procurement side. They can translate into the ingredient world. That's one thing. The other thing is for operations, maybe someone that worked in a similar industry, be it on the agricultural side or on the chemistry side, that is able to streamline the production processes because he worked for larger organizations that really focus on, let's say, valorization of side streams and how that can be translated into the ingredient production.
Bit of a side question, and this is to open the floor to either of you, but what I'm seeing across the industry, especially at companies that are preparing behind the scenes for mergers or acquisitions, or even post-acquisition as well, are bringing in different leaders that come from very different backgrounds. And this is especially within the flavors industry I'm seeing leaders come in that maybe come from long careers in maybe distribution companies, people coming from more, as you mentioned there, Kai, the B2C space. Do you think that this adds a new perspective in terms of the direction of the companies, or is it just a new way of looking at things?
Yeah. I think people with a distribution background, they are strong at understanding complexity, because the distribution business is all about finding high volumes in the markets that add, let's say, limited amount of complexity to distribute, meaning so low amount of SKU, but high volume and hopefully less complex application work, right? So they really understand the sales part of it.
Okay. Kai, staying with you just to simplify it, and this is a question that I had planned, in fact. What do you think are 2 or 3 capabilities you believe actually drive successful growth from a leadership and organizational perspective?
Yeah. There must be someone with a strong market background. And I mean market, not commercial only. So understanding the dynamics in the market, having long year experience within that competitive space to really assess strengths, weaknesses, positioning of the competitors. And second, I need someone who has experience in translating the application work into ingredient production. And those two together can be a strong combination.
And Jasper, what would you add to that from an innovation and team capability perspective?
Yeah, I think I would go back to what I said about desirability, feasibility, viability. You want to have that you want a cross-functional team which represents both of these 3 perspectives. And in practice, that's often, someone from marketing or sales, someone from R&D, and then someone more from finance or operations. And again, they have like a joint accountability about the customer and being customer focused. And they work very methodologically on it, really intellectually honest, looking at evidence and moving from there. And then maybe part of the team, I also think, is a sponsor if you talk about innovation projects. So you need to have someone, ideally C-suite or below, one level below, who is very interested in the innovation, who wants it to succeed, who is interested in integrating it in their business unit when it's ready to be scaled or when it's scaling, and who will, again, remove all these corporate barriers, make decisions when decisions need to be made. And it's not just there to, release a budget and then disappears for a couple of weeks and only comes back later.
Okay. Let's flip this slightly to the individual level for people building their careers in this industry. If someone is currently in an R&D or technical role, what do you think they need to do differently if they want to be part of commercially successful organizations, Jasper?
Yeah, I think one thing is that they need to not talk in terms of technical specs, but really in terms of outcomes. So talk much more the customer language and what it does for a customer. I think that's already great. And then the second thing is they really need to understand the P&L. I mean, they don't need to get an MBA, but they need to understand how their work is connected to profit, revenue, costs. I think if you have these 2 things, that will help them already a lot.
Okay. Is there any other skills or experience that you think that maybe they should actively be trying to build, or would that cover it, do you think?
At the moment, I think customer discovery. So being able to, especially so if I compare food, the B2C side to the B2B side, the B2C side has a lot of structured data, right? So you can get a lot out of the data, but the B2B side there's not that much data. So a lot of your insights really come from conversations with people. And people who are very good at being able to build relations and trust with customers, and then be able to sit with them and actually listen to them and figure out what they need. I think that's extremely valuable. And I also think that's not something which will be replaced by AI that soon, because it's still there's not that much data, publicly available data around. And then the second thing is, and I touched now upon it, is AI. I do think, and I mean, everybody is saying it, but there's it's really worth like spending half a day of your week playing with AI tools and building something, because the returns on your productivity and your learning at the moment are so high. So, and especially for people who are, who are stuck with Copilot working at large organizations, I think it's really worth, get your own tools outside of it. And there's a lot of publicly information available data that can already help you with your productivity. So that would be my other thing that I'm thinking about, what they should do now to improve themselves.
Yeah,
Some
right.
solid advice.
In my experience, modeling the markets, meaning understanding my market potential, is something that needs to be carried out manually, because most ingredient companies target several different markets, and with different, I mean they operate different. Yeah, some have high growth rates, some have moderate growth. Yeah, then the size of the markets can be completely different. Also, the geographical spread can be different one, and that's not something which a AI tool, in my experience, can carry out on its own.
It's an interesting time across the space. I think AI is more about learning, understanding. Going back to your point, Jasper, about those customer relationships in terms of really understanding your customer. AI, not yet, cannot replace those human interactions, sitting down with people, understanding needs, understanding requirements, what could we do to make their life easier. So yes, I think some solid points from you both there. Over to you, Kai, someone aiming for leadership roles in strategy or general management. What do you think are the biggest gaps you see in how people prepare themselves for those positions?
If you enter the ingredient space without ingredient background, I mean, that sometimes happens if someone entered strategy consulting after finishing university education, and then hopefully he has a couple of years experience with the ingredient industry, because here and there it's quite niche, right? So the industry experience adding to strategy experience, I think, is a perfect combination that really can drive a business.
Great. Okay. And what about, where do you think, I mean, people that have that experience, what about those strong candidates? Where do you think that they still fall short? Is there any areas that you think could use improvement? If at all, there might not be any.
I think one needs to look at it case by case.
Of course.
I think the ingredient industry, looking at the German-speaking part of Europe, for instance, there is about 70 companies in the ingredient space. There is activities also on the investor side, but here and there, it really comes down to understanding the business models first.
Mm-hmm. Understood. From both of your perspectives, do you think the industry is moving fast enough in developing these capabilities, or is there still a real lag between what companies need and what talent is actually available within the market? And I know that the recruitment industry isn't sort of both of your expertise, but is there any areas that you see there? This is for either of you.
I find both in the market, actually. There is companies who do good employer branding, also because they present themselves as being innovators within the food value chain. They receive a lot of creative ideas also from outside and are capable to show towards potential employees that there is really, let's say, substance behind solving the key challenges within the food industry. Whereas there is other companies that are, let's say, sitting in successful markets and do a good job themselves within a few specific categories, but they lack transporting, let's say, a proper message to the outside that it's really worth joining them.
Mm-hmm. And anything to add there from your side, Jasper?
Yeah, so this is definitely not my expertise. What I do notice is that I find consumer brands seem to be attracting more talent than the ingredient businesses. And I find it sometimes a pity, because I actually think the ingredient businesses, if you see it, all the challenges in the world, etc., they have a much bigger role to play at solving them. I also think they're often more innovative. If you look at their R&D spend, they spend much more compared to like the food CPGs, for instance. So I think there, maybe as an industry, it could do better at really showing what kind of cool innovations they do, what kind of impact it can have, and being more like showing also that B2B space is actually really interesting.
For sure.
Yeah. Agree on that, Jasper, and want to add that the capabilities of the ingredient industry, they really make the difference at the end of the day. So look at things like cultivated meat, look at things like precision fermentation. If those technologies ultimately break through or not, that question or that is decided in the ingredient space. It's not a B2C.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I personally find it a much more interesting space to be in right now than on the B2C side. But I don't want to insult anyone working on the B2C side because there's also a lot of exciting stuff happening there. But I think it could get a bit more attention.
Yeah. Final question to bring this all together. If you were building an ingredients company from zero today, Kai, what would be the first 2 or 3 hires you would make from a leadership and structure perspective, and why?
Yeah, I think I already gave an answer to that. So one profile is someone understanding the markets and really has a, let's say, thought through idea and plan on which market to target, which customer segments to target, first of all. And that needs to include a understanding of current market and competition activities. And second, then having someone who understands the application work behind. So bringing that ingredient into a wider, let's say, B2C perspective. So where to apply, how to apply that ingredient, and then translating also into the value chain. So which step of the value chain do I produce myself, or where do I start sourcing? Those kind of things.
And Jasper, from an innovation and capability perspective, what about you? What would your first hires look like in that space?
I think it's actually relatively similar to what Kai was saying. So probably I formulated more in my own words. So I think the first one would be that business builder I was talking about. Someone who, as Kai was saying, understands the market, understands the dynamic, but also someone who will spend, I think, the first weeks really with customers, listening, figuring out how they do these things, where their pains are. I think the second would probably be then a technical person, but again, customer oriented. So someone who can create that first minimal thing you can put in front of a customer and, get reactions on and then iteratively improve it. And then my third would probably be some AI wizards who can, create all kind of workflows to do, competitor analysis, patent analysis, maybe even some formulation support, where you need 5 or 10 people for. So that person would kind of free up the other two to do what I think humans are very good at still, making judgment calls, building relations, sitting with people, dealing with ambiguity. So yeah, those 3 would probably be my hires.
Great. Okay. I think there's a lot that I've learned today. And I think what's really interesting from this conversation that we've had is that whether we're talking about innovation or M&A, the same things keep coming up. It's not a lack of ideas. It's not a lack of strategy. It's how organizations are built and obviously the people inside them. So Jasper, Kai, thank you both for joining me. As I said, I've really learned a lot today and I've really enjoyed this one. And to everyone listening, if you have found this useful, please feel free to share it with someone in your network who's thinking about growth, hiring, or building teams in this space. Kai, Jasper, thank you both again. And thank you to those listening. We will see you in the next episode of The Right Ingredients. Thank you again.